In this video, I will talk about inks, their properties, and how to use them in printing. I will go over words like modifiers, viscosity, and tack. Inks are liquids or pastes that contain dyes or pigments, and they are used in pens, printing, and tattoos. Anti-counterfeiting inks, including gel inks, some fountain pen inks, and inks used for paper currency, react with the cellulose in paper to produce a permanent color change. Depending on the printmaking technique, the inks may need to be adjusted slightly with modifiers in order to print perfectly. Temperature and humidity, the type of plate, and the type of paper all affect how inks perform. While we are printing at home, I will introduce you to some household items that you can use instead of buying them to help facilitate your printing. Keep in mind, this is a very short explanation, and of course, it is always best to ask me and take notes of how your ink is performing, and then ask me for any technical advice in class or through email. Here now, I will be showing you different things. This is called a mortar and pestle. Flour or antacid or talcum powder can be used to what's called stiffen your ink. I just use regular flour. You can use any type of flour, especially if you're gluten intolerant, use something like coconut. Now, you also can use water, or you can use oil, like a simple household vegetable oil, to also create viscosity. I like to have a pencil at hand to take notes, my paper, of course, that I'm printing on, a palette knife or two, rags to clean up with, my brayer, or you can use a cardboard chip, and plenty of paper towels. And of course my ink. So first, I'm going to talk about ink and water. Water can be used in screen print inks in the shop as well as relief block ink to make it so it's less thick. Oil does the same thing with the etching crayon felt ink that we're using for woodblock and also for etching. Antacid, or the talcum powder or flour, acts like magnesium carbonate, which stiffens your ink. Actually, there is magnesium carbonate in antacid tablets, which is why I'm using it. I like to crush the antacid tablets with a mortar and pestle till it's a fine powder, just like it would be like flour. If it's not crushed up enough, what you can do is sift it through a colander into another little bowl. Take some time with this because this is a really simple, inexpensive way to create or reduce tack, meaning reduce the oily content. So here it is, and you can still see there's a couple of granules, so if you sift it, then it will go away. The oil will then increase the tack. So there's also something called extender base, which I'll talk about in a second. Yellow will always be more oily, whereas black, which has more pigment in it, will always be thicker. So what you want to do is first kind of check the length or body of the ink when you first will put out your ink onto your palette. Whenever you mix ink together, that of course is modifying the ink as well. The darker the ink is, it's always going to have a thicker quality, no matter what type of ink. The lighter, it's going to be runnier or viscous, which means it has an oily body or constitution. So with the black ink, what you're going to do is pull up your palette knife into the air and see how the ink reacts from the palette up to the knife. And if you see that it's a very short distance, that means it's a very short length. So you probably want to increase its body. Here, because the length is very long, I want to reduce any kind of, or actually add to the tack. So I mix it thoroughly, put the oil always to the side, and slowly introduce it into the body of the ink. Now, when I'm checking it, it's actually very, very tacky. So this is perfect for, let's say, an intaglio. With relief block, you always want it to be thicker though. So with uh, the yellow, what I'm going to do is add the antacid and just put a little bit in. You should always introduce a modifier to the side of the ink and then slowly add it in. So here I am continuing to understand the tack of the body through the length of how much it's reacting off the palette knife. You'll notice that it's going to start getting thicker, the ink, or less viscous, which will be similar to the black. So now I'm going to add, just because, some baby powder. Please do not breathe in any powder. It is actually very dangerous for your lungs. Here is a lot of powder. If I over thicken the ink, then it's really going to kind of make the ink almost like gummy and really unusable. So you would have to start over. You can't just keep adding oil, then powder, then oil, then powder. It really doesn't work. If your ink is really thick with, let's say, your relief block ink, you can always, for the water-based, you can always add a little bit of water. So now, if I'm adding the two together, the black and the yellow, it's actually going to create a perfect consistency for relief because of how much of the modifiers I've used. So now with extender base, there's so many other things you can use, but we're going to use extender base. You can play with transparencies, and also the more extender base, the more body you're giving your ink, so the less pigment you have to use. Just like any dark color into light, you always add the pigment to the extender base. It doesn't matter, yellow is darker than the extender base since it's clear. Make sure to thoroughly mix it, because otherwise it will get streaky. And that's true of any time you're making ink. You always want to mix thoroughly. What I'm going to do now is actually roll out just pure ink for you, and then one with the extender, so that you can see how it looks like if I've modified it. So first I'll do the pure ink that's just been altered by the magnesium carbonate, and now I'm going to use the one with the extender base. It's actually so much looser, it's harder to roll onto your brayer and takes a little bit more time. Don't get frustrated, that's just the way it does it, because you really reduce the body of the ink. So I'm rolling it across the paper just like I did the other, and notice how they have really changed, the two of them. So that's something really to keep in mind when you're actually working with extender base. Again, oil to make it oilier, flour or magnesium carbonate to thicken the body.